They waited for him to fail, certain that he didn't belong there. But when Isaiah Jackson solved a problem that even PhDs from Clarkson University struggled with, the entire lecture hall fell into absolute silence. And for the first time, those who had once looked down on him were forced to rethink what they thought they knew. Clarkson University, Oregon, on a gloomy morning, the cold white light from the ceiling bulbs shone down on the spacious lecture hall, reserved for the advanced math class. Over 100 people had settled into their seats, flipping open notebooks, starting laptops, preparing to face one of the most notorious professors in the department, Evelyn Hartwell. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Today wasn't an ordinary class. The front row wasn't just filled with students, but also a group of professors from various departments, sitting right up front like judges in a courtroom. They weren't there to learn, they were there to observe. This was an open session at Clarkson University, where Evelyn would showcase her uncompromising teaching methods for them to see. Her harshness was necessary. The weak had no place in the world of mathematics, and anyone who couldn't keep up would be weeded out from the very first round. In the middle row, an older man quietly bowed his head, his fingers twirling an old pen. He didn't draw attention, didn't chat with anyone, just wore a frayed gray wool coat, simple jeans, with a notebook full of neatly handwritten notes beside him. He was Isaiah Jackson, 68 years old. He didn't need to stand out, the numbers in his head spoke for him. But for some, his skin color alone was enough to earn their contempt. In the front row, Professor Malcolm Pierce, one of Clarkson's most influential instructors, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His gaze swept over the crowd in the class, then paused when he saw Isaiah. He smirked, whispering to the professor beside him, an old black guy in an advanced math class. I bet he won't last the whole session. Those around him nodded in agreement, as if it were obvious. These science courses aren't meant for them. Another added, his soft chuckle, barely concealed, probably snuck in through some community program. They weren't talking about math, they were talking about Isaiah, but he stayed silent. He was all too used to words like that. They thought he'd fail, thought they were right, never knowing that today would be the day they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The air in the lecture hall seemed to thicken as the sharp click of Evelyn Hartwell's high heels echoed on the tile floor. Her entrance brought a wave of absolute silence. No one dared speak. No one dared lose focus. Standing tall, her silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the cold light, her face showed no emotion beyond absolute confidence, an authority that didn't need words to assert itself. She didn't demand respect. She walked in and took it. Evelyn scanned the room, unhurried. She wasn't just checking focus, she was assessing who could keep up, who was just taking up space in her class. Her eyes landed on Isaiah, not for long, but long enough to send a wordless message. Everyone understood. Asterisk. You think you belong here? Asterisk. For a moment, she narrowed her eyes, then turned away, as if his presence wasn't worth noting. No one noticed, but Isaiah did. He'd seen those looks his whole life. She turned back, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote on the board with sharp, precise strokes. Last week we covered multivariable limits, she said, her voice steady. Today we moved to Laplace transforms. Complex equations appeared quickly, neat and exact. Students scrambled to take notes, trying not to fall behind. Some faltered at the first line, but no one dared speak up. In Evelyn's class, getting lost was your fault, not hers. In the front row, a few professors nodded, pleased with her style. They admired not just her intellect, but her harshness. To them, a good professor wasn't one who helped students grow, but one who culled the unworthy. The numbers and Laplace transforms Evelyn had just written weren't foreign to him. They were like old friends he'd met across hundreds of pages of self-taught notebooks over decades. But while he viewed them with calm familiarity, others in the lecture hall struggled, the frantic scratching of pens mixing with the clatter of laptop keys. A few students furrowed their brows, trying to keep up with Evelyn's pace, but no one dared open their mouth to ask. In her class, Getting lost was your fault, not hers. In the front row, Malcolm Pierce still wore his smirk, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Isaiah, as if waiting for a moment of failure to prove his point. "I told you," he whispered to a professor beside him, loud enough for a few nearby to hear, "this old guy will give up soon." Advanced math isn't a game for self-taught types. Those around him nodded slightly, smirks flashing across their lips. They were certain that Isaiah, with his silver hair and frail hands, couldn't possibly grasp what was happening on the board. Evelyn stood before the blackboard, posture rigid, the chalk in her hand, moving with near-perfect precision. Complex equations stacked up, line upon line, forming a mathematical maze that even the brightest students strained to follow. She said nothing more, just turned occasionally, her piercing gaze sweeping the room as if to remind them that any mistake would be caught instantly. In the front row, the visiting professors nodded, satisfied with her strictness. They believed a class like this needed someone unrelenting, someone who could eliminate the unworthy without hesitation. But then Isaiah frowned slightly. A small error, unclear to most, but to him it was like an ink smudge on a clean page. He looked at the equation on the board again, his eyes moving faster, confirming what he'd spotted. Sure enough, there was a mistake, a subtle deviation in how Evelyn applied the Laplace transform. It wouldn't show up right away, but if left unchecked, the final result would be completely off. He glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. They were just copying, like machines, not really understanding what they wrote. Evelyn kept writing, her confidence unshaken, as if she'd never made a mistake in her life. She paused, set the chalk down, and turned to the class. "Anyone want to explain this step?" she asked, her tone even but laced with a clear challenge. The lecture hall went silent. Not a single hand went up. Malcolm chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Bet that old guy wants to try, Evelyn," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Give him a shot, let's see him crash and burn." A few students snickered again, but Isaiah didn't react. He just took a light breath, set his pen down, and slowly raised his hand. The whole lecture hall seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn turned, her eyes narrowing behind her silver-rimmed glasses. She didn't speak right away, just stared at Isaiah, her gaze a mix of surprise and disdain. Malcolm sat up straighter, his grin widening. "Seriously," he whispered to the person beside him, "he's actually speaking up." Evelyn gave a slight nod, as if agreeing to a game she already knew the outcome of. "Fine," she said, her voice soft but icy. "Mr. Jackson, go ahead." Isaiah stood, walking slowly but steadily toward the board. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the chalk, a mark of age and years of hard labor, but his eyes never wavered. He pointed to a line on the board, his voice low and clear. "There's an error here. The Laplace transform was applied wrong at this step. The coefficient was introduced too early." He stopped, offering no further explanation, as if it were obvious to him. The lecture hall went so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. Evelyn stood still, arms crossed, her gaze locked on Isaiah. Malcolm laughed louder, though it sounded forced this time. "This old guy thinks he's smarter than Evelyn?" he said, voice full of mockery. "Probably just guessing." The other professors nodded faintly, but a few started studying the board more closely, as if sensing something. Evelyn didn't laugh. She stepped to the board, reviewing the equation with feigned calm. "An error, you say?" she asked, her tone light but hiding a trap. "Are you sure?" Isaiah nodded, unflinching. "Certain," he replied, his voice steady and firm. She turned back to the board, examining each line as if just going through the motions, but for a fleeting moment, a flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. She couldn't find an immediate way to dismiss him, but she wasn't about to admit it either. "Good," she said curtly, returning to her spot. "We'll move on." The lecture hall still carried an awkward silence after he pointed out the flaw in Evelyn's equation. But that silence didn't last long. Evelyn stood before the blackboard, her eyes narrowing behind her silver-rimmed glasses, no longer just a look of disdain, but now tinged with a hint of wariness. She didn't like being challenged, especially not by an old black man she believed didn't belong there. Malcolm Pierce, in the front row, kept his smirk, but his voice took on a slight edge as he whispered to the person beside him, "One lucky catch doesn't mean he knows anything." Evelyn picked up the chalk again, turning to the board, her sharp, precise strokes filling it with a new problem, far more complex than the last. The Laplace transforms now wove together with nested integrals, forming a web of symbols that made even the top students frown. She said nothing, just wrote, letting the problem's difficulty speak for her. Students scrambled to take notes, pens and laptop keys clacking again, but this time confusion was plain on many faces. A few stopped, staring blankly at the board, unsure where to begin. Isaiah watched the blackboard, his deep brown eyes moving slowly, calmly. To him, those symbols weren't a labyrinth. They were a story he'd read and reread, through hundreds of long nights of self-study. But then he paused, not from confusion, but because a memory suddenly flooded back. He recalled his years in Portland, a young man working at a lumber mill. Every night, after 10-hour shifts, he sat under the dim glow of an oil lamp, poring over old math books borrowed from the public library. His father, a poor laborer, had told him, "You don't need a classroom to prove you're smart, Isaiah. Just let the numbers speak for you." He'd promised his father that one day he would, even though the world outside never gave him a chance to step through a college door because of his skin color. In the lecture hall, Evelyn set the chalk down and turned to the class. "Anyone want to try solving this one?" she asked, her tone even but brimming with challenge. The room stayed silent. No one dared raise a hand, not even the students who'd been confident earlier. Malcolm chuckled softly, his eyes flicking to Isaiah. "Why don't you give it another go, Jackson?" he said loudly, voice thick with sarcasm. Or was last time just dumb luck? Snickers echoed from a few corners, though quieter this time, as if some were starting to wonder. Evelyn crossed her arms, her gaze locking onto Isaiah. "Fine," she said, her voice soft but sharp as a blade. "Mr. Jackson, if you're so confident, come up here and solve it." She stepped aside, leaving the blackboard open like an arena. Isaiah took a deep breath, stood, and walked forward slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he grasped the chalk, traces of age and years of hard work, but his eyes remained steady. He started writing, each stroke firm, unwavering. The complex transformations simplified cleanly under his hand, each step appearing on the board with stunning precision. The lecture hall fell silent. Students stopped scribbling, eyes glued to the board. Malcolm sat up, his grin fading. "No way," he muttered, his voice losing its earlier certainty. Evelyn stood still, arms crossed tighter, her eyes searching for a flaw, anything to discredit him, but there was none. Isaiah set the chalk down, turned to her. "Done," he said simply, his voice low and calm. She didn't reply at once. She stepped to the board, reviewing each line with forced calm. "You think this is the right answer?" she asked, her tone light but laced with a trap. Isaiah nodded. "I know it is," he said. No hesitation. A flicker of doubt passed through her eyes, but she hid it fast. She couldn't admit a mistake in front of the class, let alone let someone like Isaiah, an old black man with no formal education, unsettle her. "We'll see," she said coldly, returning to the podium. "Next." Malcolm laughed louder, though it sounded hollow. "Probably memorized it somewhere," he said to the person beside him, clinging to his confidence. "No way he gets it." But in the back row, Clara Evans, a young student with curious eyes, didn't laugh. She watched Isaiah return to his seat, then glanced at the notebook he'd left open on his desk. Pages crammed with handwritten math symbols, neat and dense like a textbook. She frowned slightly, wondering who he really was. Isaiah sat back down, opened his notebook, and resumed twirling his pen. He didn't need their belief. He'd grown used to doubt his whole life. But inside, memories of his father stirred. He recalled the last time his father held his hand, frail on a hospital bed, whispering, "Don't let them define you, Isaiah. Let the numbers do it." He'd honored that promise through every notebook page, every problem solved in the dark, and now, in this lecture hall, he knew he wasn't just facing Evelyn or Malcolm, he was facing a system that had tried to shut him out since birth. Evelyn stood at the podium, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Isaiah as if probing for a weakness to exploit. She couldn't stomach that an old black man with no degree, self-taught, had bested her challenge right in front of her class and the visiting professors. The absolute confidence she always upheld was shaken, though she refused to show it. She turned to the board, grabbed the chalk, and wrote a new problem, this time not just complex, but nearly impossible to solve quickly. Non-linear differential equations tangled with nested integrals stretched across the board from edge to edge. Students stared in dismay, some even giving up on notes, knowing they stood no chance. "This is a PhD-level problem," Evelyn said, her voice icy but challenging. "If anyone here thinks they're good enough, step up and solve it." She turned, her eyes landing squarely on Isaiah, as if the words were meant for him alone. Malcolm laughed, louder this time, regaining his swagger. "Go on, Jackson, why not?" he said, voice mocking. "Or are you out of tricks?" Snickers rang out from a few spots, but Clara Evans in the back stayed silent. She watched Isaiah, her curious eyes now mixed with a hint of awe. Isaiah took a deep breath and stood again. He walked to the board, hands trembling slightly as he took the chalk, but his gaze remained cool, unflinching. He said nothing, just started writing. Each stroke was steady, each step precise, unraveling the complex equations into a clear, logical flow. The lecture hall went quiet again, but this time it wasn't just surprise, it was shock. Students held their breath, eyes locked on the board. Malcolm straightened, his smile gone. "No way," he muttered, voice trembling. Evelyn stood rigid, arms crossed tighter, her eyes hunting for a mistake, anything to dismiss him, but there was none. Isaiah set the chalk down, turned to her. "Done," he said simply, voice low and firm. She stepped to the board, scanning each line with feigned calm. "You think this is right?" she asked, her tone soft, but hiding a snare. "I know it is," Isaiah replied, unwavering. A flicker of doubt crossed her eyes, but she masked it. She couldn't admit defeat in front of everyone, couldn't let Isaiah win outright. "Good," she said coldly, stepping back to the podium. "But we're not done." She couldn't let it end there. Her reputation, her authority in this lecture hall, was under threat from someone she saw as an outsider. She looked at Isaiah, her gaze no longer just wary, but now tinged with anger. "If you're so confident," she said, her voice even but cutting, "why not test yourself in a real arena?" The room buzzed. Malcolm raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean, Evelyn?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. Evelyn walked to the desk, resting her hand on a stack of papers. "There's a national math competition in Seattle next month," she said, her eyes never leaving Isaiah, "where the sharpest minds from universities across the country will compete. If you're as good as you think, why not join?" Whispers spread through the room. Students exchanged wide-eyed looks. "The national competition," one muttered. "That's for geniuses from Stanford, Harvard." Clara watched Isaiah, her eyes lighting up, as if urging him to say yes. Malcolm laughed heartily. "Perfect," he said, slapping the table. "Send him, Evelyn. Let's see him flop in front of the whole country." The other professors nodded, smirks on their faces. They knew that competition wasn't a place for an old self-taught man like Isaiah. They waited for him to back down, to crumble under the pressure she just laid out. But Isaiah didn't flinch. He stood still, looking at Evelyn, then Malcolm, his eyes fearless. "I'll do it," he said, his voice low but solid as rock. The lecture hall erupted in murmurs. "What?" a student blurted. "Is he for real?" Clara smiled faintly, as if she'd expected it. Malcolm leaned back, his grin stiffening. "Interesting," he said, his tone tightening. "He just dug his own grave." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by how quickly he agreed. She'd hoped he'd hesitate, panic, refuse, but he didn't. He didn't take the challenge for Evelyn or Malcolm. He did it for his father, for the promise he'd held for decades, that he'd let the numbers speak for him, that he'd prove his worth despite his skin color or age. He knew the Seattle competition wasn't just a problem to solve, it was a chance to face down a system that had tried to keep him out since birth. Evelyn stood still, her gaze colder than ever, but inside, a spark of unease flickered. She'd meant to crush Isaiah, but now she realized she might have just pushed him onto a bigger stage, one where, if he won, she'd have no way to deny him anymore. She turned to the board, wrote on, but her hand trembled slightly. Isaiah watched, eyes calm, ready for what lay ahead. 3 months. That was the time he had to prepare. Isaiah turned the public library, near Clarkson University, into his stronghold. Every morning, he arrived before even the librarians, settling at his usual corner table, under dim light, opening an old borrowed laptop from a neighbor. His frail, trembling hands, worn by age, flipped through advanced math books he'd checked out, volumes dense with symbols. Even college students hesitated to touch. He didn't just read, he analyzed, took notes, and solved the toughest problems from past national competitions over and over. To him, each problem was a challenge, each solution a way to sharpen his mind. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Isaiah's health wasn't what it used to be. Long nights under the lamp left his eyes strained, his hands shaking more with every pen stroke. His family, a sister in Portland, called, urging him to quit. "You're 68, Isaiah," she said over the phone, voice thick with worry. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Rest." But Isaiah just smiled faintly, replying, "You don't get it. I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing it for Dad, and for me." He hung up, returning to his notebook, where numbers danced in his head. Clara Evans, the young student who'd watched him curiously in class, became an unexpected ally. After that session, she met him at the library, bringing a stack of books she'd borrowed from the university library. "I don't know how you do it," she said, setting them on the table, "but I want to help." Isaiah looked at her, his deep brown eyes warming slightly. "Thank you," he said simply, asking no more. Clara stayed, sometimes asking about his solutions, sometimes just watching him write in silence. She didn't grasp everything he did, but she felt the incredible persistence in every line he penned. Evelyn Hartwell didn't sit idle. She didn't believe Isaiah could win in Seattle, but she also didn't want her reputation tied to his potential flop. A week after the class, she sent a set of special problems to the library via a student, problems harder than anything he'd face at the competition. She hoped he'd falter, give up before stepping into the arena. But Isaiah didn't. He opened the packet, eyed the tangled equations, and started solving. He sat there for hours, trembling hands tracing each step, eyes never leaving the page. He didn't just solve, he optimized, shortening steps others might take a day to finish. When he sent the answers back through Clara, Evelyn received them with a frigid stare. She said nothing, but inside, she knew he hadn't flinched. Isaiah didn't just learn to solve problems, he learned to handle pressure. He carried an old stopwatch, setting time limits for each problem, forcing himself to be faster, more precise. He recalled days at the lumber mill, calculating wood cuts in his head to avoid waste, real-world math that had trained him long ago. He studied past champions' solutions, breaking down their steps, their shortcuts, then refining them his own way. If a problem had 3 solutions, he found all 3. If a formula could be proven multiple ways, he walked every path. To him, math wasn't just about answers, it was about knowing every angle so nothing could catch him off guard. Clara watched him work, sometimes unable to hide her amazement. "Don't you get tired?" she asked one evening, as darkness cloaked the library. Isaiah paused, looking up at her. "I do," he said, voice low, "but I don't have time to rest. I've only got 3 months." Clara frowned, then grew serious. "Do you know who you'll face there? The people at this competition aren't just good, they're geniuses, trained since they were kids, guided by the best professors, with resources most people never touch. They don't make mistakes." Isaiah set his pen down, meeting her gaze. "Good," he said, voice steady as stone, "because neither do I." Days passed, and word of Isaiah joining the competition spread through Clarkson. Some students mocked him, calling him the reckless old man. Others, like Clara, started believing he could do something big. Malcolm Pierce, from afar, heard the rumors and smirked. "He'll get crushed," he told Evelyn during a department meeting. "No one like him can stand there." Evelyn didn't reply, but her eyes grew colder. She didn't want Isaiah to win, but she couldn't deny he'd cleared every hurdle she'd set. After 3 relentless months, Isaiah stepped into the vast hall at the University of Washington in Seattle, home of the national math competition. The air in the huge room was heavy and tense. White lights illuminating rows of seats filled with contestants, the sharpest minds from prestigious schools like Stanford, Harvard, and UCLA. They were young, confident, armed with modern laptops and thick books. Isaiah stood out like a misfit among them. He wore his frayed gray wool coat, frail hands clutching his handwritten notebook, silver hair catching the light. Curious, scornful, and mocking eyes turned to him as he entered. At the judges' table, Evelyn sat center, posture stiff, her silver-rimmed glasses glinting under the lights. Beside her were Malcolm Pierce and James Carter, a fair-minded professor from the University of Washington, whom Isaiah hadn't met. Evelyn watched him enter, her gaze icy and emotionless, as if still expecting the failure she'd long predicted. Malcolm smirked, whispering to James, "Look at that old guy. I bet he'll quit in the first round." James didn't reply, just raised an eyebrow, his eyes fixed on Isaiah with quiet curiosity. A loudspeaker cut through the murmurs. "Welcome, contestants, to the first round of the National Math Competition." A commanding voice boomed from the mic. "Those seated here are the finest mathematical minds of their generation. Today, we'll find out who rises above." The giant screen ahead lit up, displaying the first problem, a complex system of integrals laced with Laplace transforms. The crowd of contestants bent forward, pens and laptop keys springing to life. Some frowned at the first line, realizing this wasn't a problem for the faint-hearted. Isaiah settled at his table, placing his notebook in front of him. He didn't glance around, didn't heed the scornful looks from the young contestants. A Stanford student nearby whispered to a friend, "What's this old guy doing here? Probably wandered in from some community class." A soft laugh followed, but Isaiah ignored it. He studied the problem on the screen, his deep brown eyes moving slowly, calmly. To him, those symbols weren't a challenge. They were a story he'd memorized through countless nights of self-study. He picked up his pen and began writing. Each letter was neat, each step precise, unfolding on the page with uncanny accuracy. He didn't rush, didn't double-check, as if the answer had been in his head from the moment he saw the problem. While others paused, erased, rewrote, Isaiah wrote steadily, unflinching. He recalled those nights at the Clarkson Library, pushing himself to solve under the stopwatch's pressure. Those 3 months weren't just study, they were training to never falter. At the judges' table, Evelyn glanced at the wall clock, then down at the contestants. She noticed Isaiah writing faster than most in the room. She frowned, disbelief creeping in. Malcolm, beside her, kept his smirk. "He's probably just scribbling nonsense," he whispered to James. "No way he gets it." But James didn't answer. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Isaiah's table, as if sensing something unusual. Isaiah set his pen down, with nearly a third of the time left. He reviewed his answer once, then crossed his arms, sitting still. Other contestants kept writing, sweat beading on their foreheads, erasers working overtime. Some glanced his way, wide-eyed, unable to fathom why he'd finished so soon. Whispers spread. "He's done already?" one muttered. "No way," another replied, skeptical. The judges took notice. James stood, walked to Isaiah's table, and picked up his answer sheet. He scanned it quickly, then looked up, eyes alight with astonishment. "Not a single mistake," he said softly, to Evelyn, just loud enough for her to hear. Evelyn sat up straighter, hands gripping the table's edge, her gaze fixed on the paper in James's hands. She wanted to spot a flaw, anything to reject it, but there was none. Malcolm slumped back, his grin gone. "Probably a fluke," he mumbled, voice unsteady. Isaiah sat there, expressionless. He didn't need their approval. He'd done this his whole life without applause. But inside, his father's memory stirred. He recalled the last time his father held his hand, weak on a hospital bed, whispering, "Don't let them define you, Isaiah, let the numbers do it." He'd kept that promise, and now, in this hall, he knew he wasn't just solving a problem. He was proving he belonged, despite every scornful stare. The first round ended, the screen showing results. Isaiah Jackson's name topped the list of those advancing. The hall buzzed instantly. Young contestants turned to him, half doubting, half stunned. Evelyn stared at Isaiah, her gaze colder than ever, but now with a trace of unease. Malcolm shook his head, muttering, "He won't get much farther," but James just smiled faintly, as if he'd seen what the others hadn't yet grasped. And then, the University of Washington Hall in Seattle plunged into peak tension as the national math competition's final round began. White lights blazed down on the center stage, where two tables faced each other, the last two spots for the top two contestants. Isaiah sat there, calm as ever, his worn leather-bound notebook in hand, like an inseparable part of him. Across from him was Ethan Brooks, a young PhD, eyes sharp as knives, a confident smile on his face. He was Malcolm Pierce's greatest hope, trained remotely by him, and believed unbeatable, especially against an old self-taught black man like Isaiah Jackson. At the judges' table, Evelyn Hartwell sat center, arms crossed, her icy gaze locked on Isaiah. Beside her, Malcolm Pierce smirked, whispering to James Carter, "This is the old guy's last act. Ethan'll tear him apart." James said nothing, just watched Isaiah with a thoughtful look. Over 1,000 spectators, students, professors, mathematicians from across the country, packed the hall, murmurs rippling, as they noted the stark contrast between the contestants. "Who's that old man?" one whispered. "Must have taken a wrong turn to the stage," another snickered. But Isaiah paid no mind. He set his notebook on the table, sat still, his deep brown eyes waiting. The loudspeaker rang out. "The final round will crown the national champion. The last problem is a nonlinear differential equation, demanding not just accuracy, but speed." The giant screen above lit up, revealing the problem, a complex system of equations, packed with tricky transformations and tangled boundary conditions. The crowd stirred. This was a problem even veteran mathematicians might take hours to crack. A voice boomed from the speaker, "Time 20 minutes. Begin." Ethan dove in, pen racing across the page, his hand moving like a programmed machine. He wrote, erased, rewrote, occasionally glancing at Isaiah with a smirk. Isaiah sat still for a moment, studying the problem on the screen. He didn't rush. To him, this wasn't just a problem. It was the peak of everything he'd prepared for over 3 months, over a lifetime. He recalled those nights at the Clarkson Library, pushing himself under the stopwatch. His father's words, "Let the numbers speak for you." He picked up his pen and started writing. Each of Isaiah's letters emerged neat and firm on the page. He didn't erase, didn't pause, as if the answer was already in his head. He unraveled the complex equations with a unique approach, skipping the cumbersome steps others got stuck on. Ethan, at the other table, slowed, frowning, as he realized he'd lost his way in a calculation loop. He glanced at Isaiah, saw him writing steadily, and for the first time, his confident smile wavered. At the judges' table, Evelyn leaned forward, hands gripping the table's edge. She couldn't believe it. Isaiah was outpacing Ethan, the supposed unbeatable genius. Malcolm muttered, "He's probably guessing." "No way." But James Carter cut him off. Voice low, "Look closer, Malcolm. He's not guessing." James pointed to a side screen, where a camera zoomed in on Isaiah's work. Every step was flawless, not a single error. Time ticked on, spectators whispering, "He's finished already?" one murmured, as Isaiah set his pen down. 5 minutes left on the clock. Ethan kept writing, hands shaking, sweat rolling down his forehead. He erased a long section, tried to restart, but time ran out. Isaiah crossed his arms, sitting still, his calm gaze on the screen. When the buzzer sounded, the hall went dead silent. James stood, picking up both answer sheets. He skimmed Ethan's, frowning at the piled-up mistakes. Then he turned to Isaiah's, his eyes lighting up. "Not a single mistake," he said loudly, his voice echoing through the hall. Isaiah Jackson completed the problem, accurately, and faster. The crowd erupted, applause and cheers crashing like waves. Ethan sat frozen, pen still in hand, unable to believe he'd lost. Evelyn stiffened, her hands clenched white. Malcolm slumped back, muttering, "No way," but no one heard him anymore. James stepped onto the stage, extending a hand to Isaiah. "Congratulations, Mr. Jackson," he said, voice sincere. "You're the national champion." Isaiah shook James's hand, no smile, saying only, "Thank you." He didn't need to celebrate. This victory wasn't for show, but to keep his promise to his father. Evelyn stood, her gaze colder than ever, but she couldn't deny it. She looked at Isaiah, and for the first time, she had no words. Malcolm rose, left the judge's table without a glance, his figure fading into the crowd. The audience kept clapping, some standing, stunned that an old black self-taught man had beaten trained young geniuses. Isaiah picked up his notebook and stepped off the stage. He didn't look at Evelyn, didn't look at Malcolm. He didn't need their recognition. To him, this victory was the final answer to the scornful looks he'd endured all his life. He recalled his father, who'd believed numbers would speak for him. And today, they had, not just in this hall, but before a world that had once tried to shut him out. As he passed through the doors, the applause still echoed behind him, like an unrelenting wave. Isaiah's win at the national math competition wasn't just a title, it was a decisive blow to the fortress of prejudice that had surrounded him his whole life. News spread like wildfire, from the Seattle Hall to Clarkson University in Oregon, then across the nation. Headlines blared, 68-year-old self-taught man beats young genius. But Isaiah didn't care. Those words meant nothing compared to the promise he'd silently kept since childhood, that one day, he'd let the numbers speak for him. Days later, back in Clarkson's familiar lecture hall, the air had shifted. Students whispered about Isaiah, no longer mocking but with admiration and curiosity. Evelyn Hartwell entered, still poised, but her eyes lacked their former chill. She stood before the blackboard, facing a packed class, and for the first time, she mentioned Isaiah publicly. "Isaiah Jackson proved something," she said, voice even but free of sarcasm. "That talent knows no age or color." The words didn't come easily to her. They were the result of days wrestling with herself after the Seattle loss. She didn't apologize, didn't admit fault outright, but it was enough for everyone to see she'd shifted, even slightly. Malcolm Pierce didn't show up that day. Rumors swirled that he'd taken leave after the competition, unable to face colleagues and students after his prized Ethan Brooks flopped so badly. His credibility crumbled, and he chose to slip away quietly, his figure vanishing as it had from the Seattle Hall. For Malcolm, Isaiah's failure wasn't just a loss, it was the collapse of the worldview he'd built over years. Clara Evans, the student who'd helped Isaiah at the library, sat in the back row, smiling faintly as Evelyn spoke. She'd decided to pursue math more seriously, inspired by Isaiah. "He didn't just win the competition," she told a friend after class. "He changed how I see things." Not just Clara. Isaiah's victory rippled through the Clarkson community. Older folks, who'd thought their learning days were over, started showing up at the public library, with books and pens, asking each other, "If he did it, why can't I?" Isaiah didn't rest on his win. He turned down a teaching offer from a small college, declined interviews. "I don't need to teach anyone," he told Clara, when she asked why. "I just want to keep learning." He returned to the Clarkson library, sitting under the dim light, opening his notebook, tackling new problems. To him, the competition wasn't the end. It was a start to push himself further, to prove age was never a barrier. But his impact didn't stop there. Isaiah's story became a symbol for those sidelined by race, background, or age. It slipped into conversations at schools, in homes, making people wonder, how many talents have we missed because of prejudice? Isaiah didn't care about the fame. He just did what he'd always done. Let the numbers speak for him, as his father had believed. One quiet afternoon in the library, Isaiah looked out the window, sunlight spilling in like a memory. His father's image flickered in his mind, on a hospital bed, voice faint but firm. Don't let them define you, Isaiah. He'd lived that promise fully, not just for his father, but for himself, and for everyone dismissed like him. Isaiah set his pen down, eyes resting on a notebook page, packed with symbols and numbers, and quietly wondered, if I could do this, how many others out there could too? He had no answer, but he hoped that somewhere, someone would find their own path, just as he had. The story of Isaiah Jackson in Neston. Elite professors try to humiliate a black old man, have no idea he's a math genius, reflects real issues in today's United States, where biases about race, age, and background linger despite progress. Isaiah, a 68-year-old black man who taught himself math with old books in Portland, faced contempt from Evelyn Hartwell and Malcolm Pierce at Clarkson University, Oregon, two figures representing an elite academic class that often judges by appearance rather than ability. His win at the national math competition in Seattle wasn't just personal success, but proof that talent can break through invisible barriers, from skeptical looks in the lecture hall to pressure from young rivals at Stanford and Harvard. In modern America, similar biases persist in fields like education, jobs, and tech, where those who don't fit the mold, like Isaiah with his silver hair and worn coat, are often overlooked. His grueling preparation at the Clarkson Library, despite frail health and family pleas, mirrors the grit of many working-class Americans, especially people of color or the elderly, as they fight to prove their worth in a society that prizes degrees and youth. Clara Evans's support recalls the power of cross-generational solidarity, a key value in U.S. culture. The takeaway is, don't let others' biases define you. Let your actions and efforts speak, as Isaiah did with numbers. In real life, keep honing your skills, whether through an online course or extra hours to show what you've got, and seek out allies like Clara, people willing to see past the surface. Finally, like Isaiah refusing to rest after his win, treat each success as a stepping stone to keep pushing yourself, because in America, opportunity is there for those bold enough to break through the walls. If you enjoyed Isaiah's story and want to see more journeys of overcoming all odds, hit that subscribe button today. Thanks for joining us, and see you in the next video for more stories proving talent has no limits.